Ladies and gentlemen, we only have two champions left to cover when it comes to the 7-star gifted Guardians champions, and these two champions are none other than the bold one, and then we have the one we're talking about in today's video, who has, in my opinion, the absolute best waves. Now, Sandman is a champion that got released this year and already got their buff, so there's pretty much no hope when it comes to this champion, except for maybe a future synergy or something. But other than that, I do think he's the worst champion in the 7-star gifted Guardians Crystal. And if we actually go ahead and take a look at all the 2023 champions, in my opinion, he is the worst 2023 champion. The worst one, of course, is Gladiator, or maybe Kindred might be worst, but he does have more defensive value, which just leaves Sandman in a kind of position. He did win the last poll that I actually made, so we're gonna be discussing him in today's video. And like we always do with these kinds of videos, let's actually go over all of his abilities first, and then later on discuss why nobody plays him. Sandman is immune to bleed, poison, as well as shock effects, and his personal debuffs can be inflicted through the block and are paused during all of his special attacks, and they actually expire one at a time every single second. Now when he knocks down an opponent with a heavy attack, he will then gain an indefinite heavy proficiency passive, which increases his attack rating during his heavy attacks by a certain amount, and the max stacks of these that he can actually have is 8. But moving on to his resistance up passives, and the max stacks of these that he can have is 20, and he gains one of these each time he strikes the opponent with a light or a medium attack, and each one of these resistance up passives increase his energy as well as physical resistance by a certain amount. Now once he's struck, or if his block is struck with a critical hit, one resistance up passive will then be removed, and if Sandman would receive a poison, bleed, or shock effect from a skill champion, he then loses 2 resistance up passives. Now upon reaching 20 of these resistance up passives, he actually becomes unstable. And this unstable lasts for 20 seconds or until Sandman actually runs out of resistance ups. While this unstable is active, resistance ups can no longer be gained, and Sandman will lose 1 resistance up whenever he or his block is struck. Now when the unstable expires, all of the resistance ups will be lost, and while he's actually unstable, Sandman will gain an indefinite unstoppable passive, and when he becomes unstable, he also inflicts 10 suppression debuffs of 5% potency. While he's in the unstable state, his light attacks as well as his medium attacks will consume a resistance up when he hits the opponent, when he blocks an attack, or if he actually whiffs an attack. If the attack strikes the opponent or a block that is not well timed, he then deals a burst of physical damage. The final hit of his heavy attack, his special 1 or his special 2, will consume up to 5 resistance up passives, and for each time the opponent has been knocked down since the unstable has started, he deals a burst of physical damage on hit for each of his personal debuffs that they're suffering from, and the max that this damage can actually go up to is 20 debuffs. But as for his heavy attacks while he's unstable, if Sandman is struck with a basic attack while he's charging his heavy attack, he will then ignore the hit and become passively indestructible, and striking the opponent with the first hit of his heavy attack will passively root them for 2.25 seconds, and if the opponent has Stand Your Ground Mastery active, it'll then be removed while they are rooted, and striking a rooted opponent with a heavy attack will lock Sandman in place until the root expires or until he actually dodges back. But moving on to his special attacks, the Special 1. Upon activation, Sandman will gain a resistance up passive and then gains an additional 1 upon each hit, and upon activation of the special attack, he'll also inflict 2 petrified debuffs of 8% potency, and each hit will then inflict 2 additional petrified debuffs. But moving on to the Special 2. On activation, Sandman will gain 2 resistance ups, and he will then gain an additional 1 upon each hit, and upon activation he will also inflict 6 decelerate debuffs of 7% potency, And each hit of the attack will then inflict 3 additional decelerate debuffs, and what decelerate does is pretty much just reduce unstoppable as well as evade ability accuracy. And last but not least, the special 3. It inflicts 30 physical vulnerability debuffs of a certain potency, and it actually gives him 20 resistance up passives, and if he's actually unstable, instead of gaining the resistance ups, he will actually inflict an additional 20 physical vulnerability debuffs. But moving on to his awakened ability, while he's unstable, he'll gain an indefinite fury passive, granting him a certain amount of attack rating, and his heavy proficiency passives will be granted an additional amount of attack rating. And that is pretty much it for Sandman's abilities. A lot of debuffs, a lot going on, and of course this all just comes together to give us Sandman. But moving on to this man's appearance in half of his body is pretty much just sand, meaning there's only two things we can actually look at. His drip and then his hair, which no other champion in the game has it like him. You have champions who have no hair at all, you have champions who have fish bones on their head, but none of them even come close to this man's waves. Woo! And it only makes sense that a character like Sandman has waves since he's literally sand, he can make waves with the sand. Oh my goodness. Unfortunately, when it comes to his shirt, it's still the same one that he's been wearing for like 30 or 40 years since the comics. And it's also slightly disappointing that right now he doesn't have legs. But as soon as you take this man into a match, he'll be there wearing jeans, bro. Nah! It doesn't look good. It would have been much better if he was pretty much just floating around in sand, and for that I'll actually give his attire a 6 or 7 out of 10. But moving on to the topic of why nobody plays him. Now unfortunately for Sandman, he did get buffed, and the only thing that the buff did was slightly improve his damage, not to a point where he'd be considered a top tier champion, but just to a point where he's considered average. And this is very detrimental to his character because he does have an interesting playstyle with the whole heavy attack into root and dealing bursts of damage, but the damage just isn't that great and you can pretty much just go with another champion instead. Now one thing that does make him a little bit useful is his immunities as well as the utility. He is immune to bleed, poison as well as shock, which makes him a good option for a lot of things, but the first two are pretty common immunities to have, and the last one just go with Absman. Which leaves us only one thing, which is his utility, and as for his utility, it's not really the best. With the special 2, he inflicts decelerate debuffs, which counter evade as well as unstoppable, but these debuffs are pretty much timed, and you can't actually keep these up 100% of the match. And if you're in dire need to actually counter unstoppable or evade, there's also gonna be champions that are way better for dealing with that, rather than him who constantly has to build up with the SP2. But this does not mean he's bad, it pretty much just means that he's average and doesn't really have that much use. The only matchups where he truly shines are matchups where the opponent has a lot of regen, because he does have the best heal reversal in the game, I think. Which, yeah, it is useful, but it's not something you find in a lot of places. Another important thing to note is that this dude pretty much wants high sig, since he does gain a lot more attack rating once he's sigged up, and the difference between awakened and unawakened is a pretty huge one, and so even as a 7-star, he won't really be that great. Instead of giving us Sandman, they probably should have given us Immortal Hulk, because Sandman is just a bit too lacking. Now this does not mean he is a bad champion, it's just that compared to all the other champions in the crystal, there's no way you're gonna be happy with pulling this dude. But anyways, that is it for Sandman. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think of him. Make sure to join my Discord group, the link will be down in the description. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace!